Hurt people hurt people. This is a phrase that's born out of trauma theory, and unfortunately, like a lot of other phrases that is based in truth, it can grow to kind of a place of cliche or even sometimes to a point of excuse for behavior. It's also the lens through which the first story can be viewed. It might be overused, but it's overused because it's based in truth. So we don't know how long Lot and his daughters were living alone in this cave before the events of our first narrative for today. Reminder, references are listed there in the description. But we do know what preceded these events, and that is key. So first, remember that Lot offered up these same daughters to a band of men explicit in their intention of rape. Thankfully, angels intervened and got the daughters out, so they were spared of that. The trauma, the impact, the intent is still there. Second, their fiancés died in the destruction of Sodom because they just didn't believe Lot, and so they didn't leave. And then third, as they're fleeing, right, already grieving their fiancés and the future that represented, they also watched their mother die in a very traumatic way. So now here they are, out of the home they've ever known, stripped of the future they had planned and assumed. They are husbandless, motherless. They are trapped in a cave with the man who offered them up, who also happens to be their dad, so that's a hard thing to reconcile. They feel trapped with no prospect of getting free. And it's from that state that the older daughter concocts this plan to obtain their freedom for herself, for her sister. It's a plan, though, that includes a different sexual assault. Because to be clear, this is not consensual. In fact, there's not even an option of consent from Lot. As the text implies, Lot is essentially passed out in each occurrence. I can't excuse their behavior. There is nothing that makes rape the right answer. Is this why his daughters remain unnamed? Possibly. Yet still, we tell their stories because they acted out of their own grief and trauma. It doesn't make it okay, though in grief and trauma and the way that impacts the brain, it does make sense. Because hurt people do hurt people. And Lot's daughters were some of the very earliest proof of that truth. So fast forward generations to Lydia and the demon-possessed slave girl. Overall, what we know of Lydia's story is this, what I would call a beacon of hope sandwiched between these two very tragic stories. Lydia is prominent and wealthy. She's a Gentile woman who is a believer. She's the head of her household, and by the time Paul and Silas arrive, she has become aware enough of the message of Jesus to be open to the message Paul is presenting here by the water. So, yes, I want to highlight that Paul is preaching here to a group of women who are soon to become some of the earliest spreaders of the gospel, right? Paul is evangelizing to this group of women, and through this group of women, the church will grow. Lydia expresses her belief in the message and is baptized, and through her baptism, many members of her household are baptized. Her reputation is such that the others opened themselves to God because Lydia herself was open. And through her, a branch of the Christian church is built. In Lydia, there is hope. Hope of the inclusion of women building the church. Hope that all is not lost if a woman is single. Hope that her financial security is not dependent on a prominent father or husband, for she made her own way. People know Lydia for Lydia and her alone. This is a stark contrast to the future Lot's daughters saw for themselves. Whether they were unaware of neighboring groups of people and options for spouses, or whether they believed they were not allowed to seek husbands from those places, none of that is made clear to us. What Lot's daughters knew is that it was now upon their shoulders to maintain the family line. And so they concocted their own measures that would allow them to do so. It's hard to see hope in their story. So now flip that sandwich over to the story that immediately follows that of Lydia, to the demon-possessed slave girl, who was also a fortune teller. We know from the text that at least part of the time, what she foretold was true, because upon seeing Paul and Silas, what she proclaimed is this: "These men are servants of the Most High God, and they have come to tell you how to be saved." The purpose of this series is not to get into the weeds about the reality of the spiritual realm, which I happen to believe is true, but rather to elevate the stories of women included in the Bible, because, quite frankly, it is an oddity that the women's stories are included if you consider the culture in which the scribers of the Bible lived. So here is this young girl living in captivity, forced by her owners to make them money with her special power. She was likely living in unsafe conditions with little to nothing that she could truly call her own. There's so little about her that I can't help but be curious. What happened to her family? Had she heard of these men? The one they called Jesus, and therefore she followed them, and she called out to Paul and Silas, not because of the demon inside her, but because she was asking for help in the only way she safely could. Did she have any of the basic necessities? In other words, what was her trauma story? Here is where the transcribers reveal their bias. All we know is that Paul got frustrated with this girl. Again, was she simply trying to signal for help? And from that place of frustration, Paul casts out the demon. In that instance, Paul stripped away the only chance of livelihood this girl had ever known, without any apparent regard for what would happen to her as a result. One can argue that we don't know what happened to her, because the point, as the transcribers write it, is what happened next to Paul and Silas. What if we slow down the narrative and take another angle, though? Wilcox points out how this one action of Paul's shows how far in this short amount of time the followers had already gotten from the teachings and ways of Jesus. consider if Jesus had met this girl. Given how he cared for Mary Magdalene and welcomed her into his circle, I don't think it's a stretch to say Jesus would not have approached this girl or appreciated Paul's tactics. He wouldn't have approached her the way Paul did. And he certainly wouldn't have cast out her demons from a posture of frustration instead of compassion. 3 women with stories of trauma, 1 woman with a story that appears ideal, though likely included some bumps around the way, right? Nobody's life truly is perfect. So what unites them? What is the thread that connects them to one another? I know that this is a very Sunday school children's sermon answer, but stick with me on this one. The answer is Jesus, right? Lot's daughters, both conceived from those acts, and from their sons came 2 of Israel's most lasting enemies, the Ammonites and the Moabites. It sounds bleak, and yet Israel never defeated either of these peoples because they were forbidden to do so. And even more than that, the connection to Jesus quite literally flows through the Moabites because it extends back through the person of Ruth, the Moabite, David's great-grandmother. We don't know any of Lydia's backstory, how she got to where she is in life, but we know that her heart was open and she listened and heard the Spirit. Through her, Jesus' name spreads through her vicinity and the church grows. The early church grew through the understanding that women's voices are needed. I wish I could tell you where that message got lost. I have some ideas. We'll talk about that another time. So, line of Jesus, quite literally, through Lot's daughters and the Moabites. Lydia telling the story of Jesus after receiving it herself. And what of the enslaved girl? What is the thread of Jesus for her? We don't know. Again, though, I choose to believe the Spirit did what Spirit does. And in my heart, imagine this with me, in my heart, Lydia took this girl, still in Philippi, this is possible. Lydia took in this girl, helped her find her new way, some healing, and a new life. Hurt people still hurt people. To my siblings in both the RCA and the CRC who are grieving, who have been ousted, who are not viewed or treated as equally created beings, know that you are seen, you are loved, you are needed in this body just as you've been created to be. I pray that people are placed in your path who help you grieve, help you restore your sense of self and knowledge that you do not need to change who you have been created to be welcomed into a community of believers. And that, if you want one, a community of Lydias would surround you and welcome you in. I tell the stories of these women in the Bible because too often the stories of these women represent what many today are still experiencing. Trauma unseen is trauma unhealed. And unhealed trauma begets more trauma. We see Lot's daughters in the face of those who see no hope or way of life other than selling their bodies on the streets. We see the young girl who was freed and then forgotten. Story never to be completed to our knowledge. In the face of every parent counseled to birth their miracle child and then abandoned for the remainder of that child's life, especially by the church. Thankfully, we do still find Lydia today. We find her, who I choose to believe she was, in organizations like Room for All One Body, Sherman Street CRC, the ones who see grief, who fight for equity, and who reflect a different, truer story to those who most need to see and experience that truth. I do this for them. I do this alongside them. I do this because they are called. We are called to reflect the truth. You are called just as you are, just as you've been created in the image of God. We're on this ride together because she is called and she is speaking. Join me in spreading this truth around.